Well, if you're just joining with me, this week we've been looking at chapter 7, the book of Proverbs, and we're really kind of picking up the conversation where we left off yesterday in verse 10, where Solomon is warning the young man, the young son, about becoming subject to really predatory people by being drawn into temptation. And, it's interesting because one of the things that the Apostle Paul said is, to the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are impure, everything becomes impure. In other words, the real theater of life where it's played out is in our own thinking and our own minds. And that's why we need to guard what we allow to enter in to our minds, through our eyes and through our thoughts and so forth, because those things, when they come in, if they're not of God, we need to learn to reject them. We need to kind of identify them immediately as being ungodly thoughts, so that we don't give ourselves permission to meditate and ruminate about things that are out of bounds and that God said shouldn't be part of your life. And that's where he's talking about how the young man we talked about yesterday, he finds himself, because of his sensuality and his insensibility, goes in the direction at night to a place where he's going to encounter dark things. And that's why you find, even in cities, in a very practical way, where are drugs and prostitution and other criminal behaviors of excess taking place? Well, we all know that every city has that part of the city, and people who are into those things know where that part of the city is, and they go there. And people like you and me, I hope, who are smart enough saying, I'm not interested in going into that part of town. I'm not interested in going in there. Yeah, I know there is ministry that can be happening there, but even that has its own dangers. And that's why you never go in there alone. You never go into that conversation by yourself, but you bring other people with you who can be there to protect you and be a shield around you and to pray for you. And I would never, if you're going to go into a part of the community where there's a lot of darkness, I would never encourage you to go alone or without a tremendous amount of covering prayer. Because if you think you can just simply go in your own strength, you will probably be overwhelmed and overtaken and caught up in stuff. I've just seen it happen too many times, where people are drawn back into the life of sin because they think it's loving to simply associate with people that was part of their past life. And as a result, they just become entangled in the ways of their past life. It's not because we're better than them. It's not because we think ourselves to be more important than them. It really comes down to the fact of recognizing our own weakness and our own vulnerability and not being arrogant about that. To recognize that, yes, I need to share Christ with people who are caught up in what I was caught up in, but I need to do it from a place of strength. And that really is being founded in the Word, grounded in the Word, covered with prayer, and accompanied by prayer warriors who will help me maintain my self-control in the middle of that situation. And that's why this young man has foolishly gone into an environment where he knows he's going to be tempted. And when she sees him in the neighborhood, she doesn't go into his neighborhood, he goes into hers, and then she comes out to meet him. One of the things I learned from Billy Graham early on in my ministry was that when Billy Graham would go into a city to do a crusade, he would have his team, they would reserve 2 floors in the hotel, and the top floor would be Billy and his associates, and he would always room with one of his team members who was a man. And the women would be on a second floor, and they would all be together, and they were not allowed to pass those. In fact, oftentimes they would place guards at the elevator and the stairs to make sure that nobody was traveling between those floors that shouldn't be doing it. Now, you might say, well, that seems very extreme. Well, let's look back at the track record. Billy Graham maintained his moral purity, and his team maintained their moral purity throughout the whole history of his ministry. And they did it by taking decisive decisions. That's why I found that in my own church, when we were building out our offices, one of the things I did is had them put in glass panel doors in every office so that nobody could be doing anything in secret behind closed doors. Now, that may sound again extreme, and it did cost more for those doors, but the whole point was we wanted to have obvious transparency, and we don't have men engaging in any kind of long-term counseling with women. If a woman comes in for counseling, myself or my staff members may meet with them once, and then we will turn them over to one of our female counselors, and vice versa with men as well. Because we just know there's a dynamic in counseling called transference, that if you spend enough time working with somebody in an intimate counseling session, Even in ministry, I've seen this with worship teams where a guy and a gal are working together in worship ministry. And suddenly this affection develops between them. And fortunately, that's never ended up becoming a catastrophe, but it had the potential. It had the potential. It always became when people who shouldn't be hanging out together in intimate, undisclosed private sessions were doing so. And so that's why I think it makes more sense never to go put yourself in the position where you can be compromised. Even if you say, well, I have no intention or I would never do that, don't kid yourself. You can easily be tempted. But one of the things he says about this woman who comes out to meet the naive young man is that she is loud and she's defiant. In other words, she's shameless. She is not embarrassed or feel any remorse or any regard to how over the top her behavior is, because her feet never stay at home. In other words, this isn't the first time. This has become a pattern in her life. And I think that's important to understand, that many people who really transgress on a regular basis, even ones who say they're Christians, their failings are not unique to them or first time. This is something that they have practiced over a period of time. You'll find that the pathway that leads to their sin is one that's well traveled, and you don't have any trouble finding it, and you'll find that they are very familiar and comfortable with it. They've come to a hardening of their conscience where they no longer are convicted by the sin that they're in. In fact, Jude described them this way in his short little letter. He said they're ungodly people. In other words, God doesn't factor into their decision-making process, who pervert the grace of our God into a license, literally a permission for immorality, and deny Jesus Christ, our Lord, sovereign and Lord. He says, on the strength of their dreams, these ungodly people pollute their own bodies, reject authority, that's God's authority or anybody's authority, and they're like wild waves of the sea, foaming up their shame, wandering stars. I mean, he says, these people are just off the hook. And we need to understand that that people who are caught up in these kind of behaviors and the lifestyle didn't just simply slip in them by chance, but it becomes something that's practiced and habitual. And that's why they're called ungodly. God is not a factor in their decision-making process. Now, they may not see themselves as being demonic, but they really, by each time engaging in the same behavior, are inviting demons to take control of them. And eventually they will become oppressed by those demonic forces, and then eventually they can become possessed by those demonic forces. And so you're just not dealing with people with bad behavior. You're dealing with people who are under the control of the evil one, and they are attempting, as Paul said in 2 Timothy, to take you captive, so you too will do Satan's will instead of doing the will of God. And that's what's going on here. And the failure to see that whole spiritual dimension really is what creates such a deep vulnerability on the part of many people. And so it is that her behavior is not hidden. Once you come into her realm, it becomes wide open. It's in the street, he says. It's in the squares. It's on every corner. And what is she doing? She's lurking. Lurking means it's like an eagle perched, waiting for something to capture and kill. And she basically flies upon the prey. She takes hold of him. She kisses him. And she does it with a brazen face. A brazen face. A face that has no sense of shame, no sense of remorse. And that's why I don't want to beat this horse to the point where you can never ride it again. But the whole point is, maybe that is the point, to beat it so you can't ride it, that you would just avoid it, because we don't take temptation serious enough many times. We assume that we have a level of strength and resistance that frankly oftentimes we don't have. And I've found that no matter where I've traveled in the world, there are opportunities everywhere, not because you're looking for them, but they just simply find you. And that's why I think it's so important to basically always make sure that you have a security around you. Traveling alone is not a good idea. I'm just saying that. It's always important. I love to travel with my wife because it just removes any kind of concern of any kind of temptation. And that's the end of the story. So I remember one time I was in Russia, and one of the gentlemen that I was working with at the time, and traveling with over there with, he told me that he'd gotten a phone call in his hotel room over the night, because a lot of times prostitutes would call the hotel rooms. And he said that this woman called him and, was inviting herself up to his room. And he said no. And she said, why not? And he said, well, two reasons. Number one is I love my wife. And number two, I fear God. And then he says, I thought for a minute, and I thought, well, no, actually, it's the other way around. I love God and I fear my wife. And we laughed. He was kind of humorous that way, and he was being jesting. But the whole point was that these are things that are central to our existence, and we don't want to compromise the love relationships we have with the most important people in our life, especially husbands and wives and children and so forth. So again, in my book on marriage, I have a whole chapter dealing with the consequences of infidelity. And if you're struggling or wondering about this, I would encourage you to read that chapter and the consequences of a fall, and see if that doesn't help you to view it more clearly. Anyway, good week, I hope. A lot of stuff to talk about. Things are really interesting. And next week, we'll pick up by following the storyline of this young man who intentionally took a wrong turn and will have really negative consequences to his life. God bless you. See you next week.